Good afternoon, everybody. To anyone who might be out there. If not, this is going to be recorded. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you are seeing this. My name is Sean Kennedy. This is
Martha Cantu.
And yeah, we're going to take a look at The Heart of Darkness, part one today. And so we'll have future episodes, perhaps this semester, maybe next on part two and part three. Since this book is divided up into three parts. But yeah, so The Heart of Darkness is a very interesting tale, a very interesting novella that this here has lots of critical essays, so it's a very thick book, but it is a very thin book if you just have the straight novella, which is deceiving because I clearly remember once this was assigned by the Common Reading Text Committee, I thought, cool, I'll dig up my book. I got it. It was very small. I went, nice, a small book. And then I started reading it and went, oh my goodness, there's every single word in here counts. And you have to read it incredibly careful. So that's what we're going to do. So this episode in this series of episodes hopefully will serve as a guide for students grappling and struggling with this text as we're going through this. And so basically this book is a very simple story. It's just about 4 or 5 guys on a small ship in the Thames, the river that goes into London. And there's this blowhard that starts talking, and they're kind of stuck with him, so they just have to listen. But he's going to talk about his adventures into the Belgium Congo, and so it's a narrative within a narrative, basically. Is there anything you wanted to start before we started taking deep into it?
It's during imperialism, right? The scramble for Africa, which the Belgians are not the only ones in Africa. The French, the British, the Germans, right? The Dutch, everyone is taking stuff for Africa, from Africa, for their industrialization, right? It's the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah.
And
yeah, so this marks by the 1860s, 1870s. And are we able to pull up that map? This might be a good time to pull up the map of like the beginning. Yeah, oh, thank you. You got that all in the PowerPoint. Cool. So what's interesting about European colonization, it really begins with the slave trade going back to the 1500s. Yeah, what's interesting though about African imperialism from Europeans is it takes a long time for them to penetrate the interior of the continent, which if you contrast the Americas, even though it wasn't as swift as Europeans probably wanted it, relatively, the Europeans were able to go in. And the key difference isn't military might. That is, Native Americans were weaker than the Africans. It's disease, right? So Africans have also participated in husbandry, livestock, and they have been in contact with Europeans over millennia. And so they were not susceptible to diseases like the flu, smallpox, measles. So it is going to take quite a bit of time, but basically at the publication of this book, we are seeing the full-fledged. So this is a map from 1880. If we can go to the map, I think to 1915. So you see all those white spaces. And then here we see Belgium, Italy, Britain, the Portuguese, the French, Spanish, German, and others.
And while we're there, just because the map is there, if you see where the Empire of Ethiopia is, it says independent. Well, Ethiopia was a Christian nation. So they couldn't justify bringing civilization and Christianity and overpowering a Christian nation.
Well, it's very Christian of them.
They're Christian duty. So that's why over to the eastern side of Africa, right? The Empire of Ethiopia will stay independent because their justification for conquest isn't necessarily there.
Yes. Yeah. No, great point. Yeah, and then you see right almost in the middle of Africa, Belgium, Congo. So that's the setting in yellow there. That is the setting of this book here. So yeah, we could take that.
And what you were talking about, that the Africa in the settlement of the Americas, right? The natives are the ones dying of disease, but in trying to get to Africa, it's the white settlers or colonial people,
Yeah.
imperialist people that are dying of diseases
Yeah,
in
like
Africa.
malaria.
So it's like
Yeah.
the opposite
Yeah,
there.
great point. Yeah. So yeah, we could take the map down and yeah, let's get into this. So yeah, I would just like to start off by pointing out just how careful Conrad has written. And, you know, and what's great about this book, this is a book that you could pick up over the course of a lifetime. And, you know, your first read of this is going to be, okay, what's going on? But if you read it a few times, especially in concert with learning about US history, even though this book has nothing to do with history, it's definitely a template for colonialism and the brutality and the dehumanization that is all part and parcel of it. And so this book, so for instance, this book opens up the Nelly, a cruising yawl. It's a type of ship swung to her anchor with a flutter of the sails and was at rest. The flood had made the wind was nearly calm, and being bound down the river, the only thing for it was to come and to wait for the turn of the tide. So the first scene of this book is they are stuck, right? They're stuck in the Thames, the river that feeds into London. And so that's interesting, right? So you have these characters that are stuck, and indeed they are. That's very symbolic because you're going to see themes of people just kind of being stuck in a mindset, stuck in reason, efficiency, which we would definitely are going to talk about later, which is definitely at the heart of darkness.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to start about when he starts to talk. Marlowe is going to be the narrator. He says his first comment was, "And this," said Marlowe suddenly, "has been one of the darkest places of the earth." So he's talking about England, right?
Yeah.
And it had been one of the darkest places. So he goes on and talks about how, imagine, right? Then on mine is page 8. I was thinking of very old times when the Romans first came here 1900 years ago the other day. Light came out of this river since, you say, night? Yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds. We live in a flicker. We live in the flicker. May it last as long as the old earth keeps rolling. But darkness was here yesterday. And he's talking about like how civilization was not, right, in England at the time. Imagine the feelings of a commander. So it's almost like he's talking about, he's trying to picture and wonder like, someone like me who went to the Belgian Congo. Imagine someone coming to England and thinking, what is this place, right? This is like the worst place to be. Because he says, imagine the feelings of a commander of a fine, what you call them, and I don't know that word. Is it triam in the Mediterranean, right? So he's the commander of a fine, I guess, naval, some sort of ship, boat in the Mediterranean, ordered suddenly to the north, run overland across the Gulls in a hurry, put in charge of one of these craft, the legionnaires, a wonderful lot of handymen they must have been too. So it's like he's putting himself, like imagining how it was to come to England, the Romans, and it's the same story, parallel, right, thinking to him in the Belgian Congo. And he says, a wonderful lot of handyman, and they must have been used to build apparently by the hundred in a month or two, if we may believe what we read. Imagine him here, speaking of England, the very end of the world. a sea the color of lead, a sky the color of smoke, a kind of ship about as rigid as a concertina, and going up this river with stores or orders or what you like, sandbanks, marshes, forests, savages, precious little to eat, fit for a civilized man, nothing but Thames water to drink. So he's saying, London was uncivilized before, England was uncivilized before, the Romans came and civilized them. So it's almost also like the march of history. This is what happens.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so he says, no feathering wine here, no going ashore. So not the luxuries, right? Here and there, a military camp lost in wilderness, like a needle in a bundle of hay, cold, fog, tempest, disease, exile, and death, right? Death skulking in the air, in the water, in the bush. Like, so it's kind of like, I don't know, I see the parallels. They must have been dying like flies here, right? The Romans must have been dying like flies here. Oh, yes, he did it. Did it very well too, no doubt, and without thinking much about it either, except afterwards to brag of what he had gone through in his time, perhaps, which is exactly what Marlowe's going to do, right? Brag about his time at the Belgian colony. Um,
Mhm.
okay, so there were men enough to face the darkness, right? So they faced the darkness there. And perhaps he was cheered by keeping his eye on a chance promotion to the fleet at Ravenna by and by. If he had good friends in Rome and survived the awful climate, which he's looking for friends to help him, right? That's what he had done. He had been looking for friends to help him get to the Congo. Or think of a decent young citizen in a toga, perhaps too much dice, coming out here in the train of some prefect or tax gatherer or trade to mend his fortunes. And I'll get back to that about trade, tax gatherer. Land in a swamp, march through the woods, and in some inland post feel the savagery, the utter savagery, which is what he's going to feel in Africa, had closed around him, right? So this is the man in the toga the Roman feeling the savagery there. Had closed around him all that mysterious life of the wilderness that stirs in the forest, in the jungles, in the hearts of wild men. There's no initiation either into such mysteries. He has to live in the midst of the incomprehensible, which is what he's going to do, which is also detestable, right? Which it was detestable to him. And it has a fascination too that goes to work upon him. The fascination of the abomination, which is all about how he feels about Africa, right? That it's an abomination. Imagine the growing regrets, the longing to escape, the powerless disgust, the surrender, the hate. So
yeah, so that is really interesting, and I want to put a pin in that because, again, for students reading this book, how does this apply to U.S. history? I definitely want to bring in an element of U.S. history in a second, but what you brought up is, the major theme of this book is darkness, and the subtlety of Conrad at first. He brings in that right at the beginning, right? So just to go back, he's just, and this is the narrator of the book. This isn't Marlowe talking. So he says, yet it is seemed connected to everything. He's talking about the tide in the river. In the offing, the sea and the sky were welded together without a joint. And in the luminous space, the tan sails of the barges drifted up at the tide seemed to stand still in the red clusters of canvas, sharply peaked with gleams of varnished spirits. A haze rested on the low shores that ran out to sea in vanishing flatness. The air was dark above Gravesend, and farther back still seemed condensed into a mournful gloom, brooding motionless over the biggest and greatest town on earth, London. Right. So we'll get to the historic London before Rome got there in a second, but the director, or return to that, the director of the companies was our captain and our host. We four affectionately watched his back. That's key. This is where it's subtle, right? Okay, you're looking at this guy from the back. Okay, So that's at the surface of what's going on. As he stood in the bows looking to seaward, he's looking onward, right?
Mhm.
So they see him from the back, and he's great and against the backdrop there, and he represents something here. On the whole river, there was nothing that looked so nautical.
Mhm.
He resembled a pilot, which to the seaman is trustworthiness personified. So the captain, trustworthiness personified, yet he's not going to be out there doing the ship's work. He's going to be back in the city in the gloom, and the gloom of darkness represents evil.
Mhm.
So from my taking, there's 3 layers of Heart of Darkness to look for when you're reading this book, right? On the surface, the Congo, the jungle, the natives, that's darkness. And then there seems to be an effect that the jungle and the natives and the savagery has on the people. That's the second layer. But the third layer, which we'll probably be able to point out a little bit more specifically in some of the things we're pointing out here is, was that darkness already with them?
Right.
Right? In the frenetic chase of wealth, power, prestige, right? This is a minor thing, but this is something you want to be careful in reading too. So he's going on talking about just more about who's on the boat, right? Between us, there was, I've said already somewhere, the bond of the sea. Besides holding our hearts together through long periods of separation, it had the effect of making us tolerant of each other's yarns, even convictions. The lawyer, the best of old fellows. So that's ironic, right? He's not a best of old fellow, according to the narrator. And then if you read carefully, you kind of get he's being sarcastic here. Best of old fellow had, because of his many years and many virtues, the only cushion on deck, and was lying on the only rug. The accountant had brought out already a box of dominoes and was toying architecturally with the bones. So a couple of things there. One, yeah, this lawyer guy, he's not a virtuous guy. He's taking up the few luxuries that are on this little ship. And then, yeah, they're so seemingly, okay, there's hanging around. They got some dominoes to play with to pass the time, but what are the dominoes made of? They're made of ivory, right? And so we're getting an introduction to what colonialism is, or these men of leisure, or when they have leisure, they can sit and play games with these tusks from elephants that they have extracted from the heart of darkness in the Congo, right?
So obviously this is about the British Empire, and in my book and on page 7, he talks about it, right? The tidal current runs to and fro in its unceasing service, crowded with memories of men and ships it had borne to the rest of home, or to the battles of the sea. It had known and served all the men of whom the nation is proud, from Sir Francis Drake to Sir John Franklin, knights all. He goes on to talk about the trade. It had known the ships and the men. They had sailed from Deptford and Greenwich, from Erith, I don't know, the adventurers and the settlers, kingships and the ships of men, on change, captains, admirals, and the dark interlopers of the Eastern trade, which goes back to imperialism, and the commissioned generals of East India fleets, hunters for gold or ivory, or pursuers of fame. They had all gone out on that stream, bearing the sword, which is, I want to get to that, and often the torch, messengers, which the torch brings light, right? Messengers of the might within the land, bearers of a spark from the sacred fire. What greatness had not floated on the ebb of that river into the mystery of an unknown earth? The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealths, the germs of empires, right? So when I teach imperialism in my classes, we talk about merchants, military, and missionaries, right? The 3 M's. And you see it all here, right? The military, when he just talks about the going out with the sword to conquer the conquest, right? And then missionaries, which the aunt, right, is like, I don't know, we'll get to her, but his aunt is like the worker is worthy of his wages and go and save these people is basically what she's telling him to do, Marlowe's aunt. And then of course you have the merchants, right, which is all about extracting those
Mhm.
those resources
Who are
from them.
leveraging government to be
Mhm.
able to pave a way for them using
Yes.
military to go in so they can
Yes.
extract. In fact, in the lecture I do on the Spanish-American War, I share a quote from the National American manufacturers who were pushing McKinley to
Mhm.
conquer the Philippines after
Right.
they won the Spanish-American War. And I forget the quote exactly, but it was something to the effect of the killing of a missionary will justify our
Mhm.
conquest, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, send the
Yeah, yeah.
missionaries in.
Yeah, yeah.
And then if when they get killed, and they will,
Yeah.
then we can go in and save Christendom.
Which
Christendom.
I mentioned even now, right? In Haiti, there was missionaries who were kidnapped, American missionaries. But this time, one of the I think he works for the State Department. He's like, we've been telling these people don't go out there. It's a dangerous place. And then they go out there and they get themselves in trouble, right? And
They're
so,
doing the Lord's work.
yes.
Yeah. One thing I found really interesting, where is it? Oh yeah. When Marlowe was introduced, I don't know what to make of this, but Marlowe, and I don't have since everybody's probably got a different copy, I didn't bother saying that it's in the beginning, right? So this is still the narrator, the meta narrator. Marlowe sat cross-legged, right aft, leaning against the mizzen's mast. He had sunken cheeks, a yellow complexion, a straight back, an aesthetic aspect, and with his arms dropped, the palms of his hands outwards resembled an idol. And where does it go?
Again, when he says mind, are you going to mind? He began again, lifting one arm from the elbow, the palm of the hand outward, so that he, with his legs folded before him, he had the pose of a Buddha.
Yeah.
Preaching in European clothes. So he's like reversed, right?
Yeah. So he's sitting there on the deck like a Buddha, looking upright, but he looks like an idol. So I don't know what to make of that, as if he's bringing this other way of looking at this colonialism, because Marlowe is going to be very critical. He's critical of everybody, right? He doesn't like anybody. Yeah, so right from the outset, there's no way that we're to trust the narrative, and the narrator and his perspective without some sort of questioning. Who is this guy really? And what is he bringing to this? It's just a very interesting, this
Yeah, so that's a question for Dr. Nelson there. That
is he out there? Help
I'm
us.
not sure.
Yeah, but yeah, it's just here we have Western civilization kind of unmoored with these lofty ideals of liberty, quality of law, but with no connection to anything. So, and it's all coming out of the age of reason. And the major criticism of the age of reason that we first see with the first great awakening is y'all are trying to take place of God. And okay, so we're going to have all of these rights and the equality of the individual and the worth of the individual tethered from the source.
And society is going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And we just read John Adams when Abigail Adams says, "Remember the ladies," right? Or else we're going to go into rebellion. And John Adams says, "Yeah, we've heard that the masters are not going to listen to their that the slaves are not going to listen to their masters anymore, and that we're breaking the bonds of society.
Indians are
gonna
defying their guardians.
Yes. And it's like, because without God and without, like the American Revolution, right? It was about their rights. And it starts to question the divine right of kings, right? And it's like, who died and made you king? But then it's like, is society all gonna break up because we're not
Yeah, because the backdrop of the American Revolution isn't necessarily, of course, they're breaking free from Great Britain, but there's a great quote I share of Benjamin Rush. I don't have the quote with me, but he's basically saying, was the American Revolution the war? No, it wasn't the war. That was just the first act of this great drama, right? More to come, guys. And it was almost a warning to his colleagues, the founding fathers, of
Right.
we've disrupted the very essence of hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And we've used all of these lofty words. And, I talk about how the Declaration of Independence, based on John Locke's writings, is not necessary. It wasn't as if an enslaved person would read that and going, oh, cool, I didn't know I was equal. It's sort of like, if you've ever been heartbroken, you hear a sad song, you're just like, oh, that song gets me, right? Of course, the Declaration of Independence with its lofty rhetoric is going to speak to lots of people. And then the very questions of all hierarchies are coming into play, which is held society together for the benefit of the political and economic elite. And Benjamin Rush is like, oh boy, guys,
what have we done? Yes.
Yeah. So to get back to, unless there was another point, because I would like to talk, to bring this into US history, this, and just to reiterate, so when the Romans first came here 1900 years ago, the other day, light came out of this river. Since you say nights, yes, but it is like a running blaze on a plain, like a flash of lightning in the clouds, right? So, but the darkness was here, right, in London, in England, yesterday. Imagine the feelings of a commander, a Roman commander of a fine. What do you call them? Tyranny in the Mediterranean. And then he goes on to, and I think you've already read this. Yeah, you've already read through this, so we don't need to read this again, but he's describing this process of civilization. And the one thing that he says that distincts us, the British, right, or Europeans, is none of us would feel exactly like this if we had been Romans. And so he's just talking about the conquest and all of that, and just these military men who have their, like Caesar, who have their legions and they're just conquesting and getting and raping and pillaging for their own personal benefit. And so there's just this almost the savagery in the Roman Empire, but not us, right? What saves us is efficiency.
Yeah.
Really key in on that word efficiency. That is, I think, at the bedrock of what the heart of darkness is, the devotion. So he continues, and this is Marlowe speaking, the devotion to efficiency. That's what saves us. And right, so thank you for being here at 12 o'clock. Thank you, Simon, for getting everything ready as quickly as we could around 12 o'clock. We were a little inefficient today, but so, to be expected with technology. But yeah, we are all tied to efficiency. We're tied to the clock. We're tied to the dollar. We're tied to the marketplace. Be here at 8. Don't leave till 5, right? Oh, yeah. For instance, my son was sick over the week. He had a high temperature, coughing, sneezing, and my wife was terribly upset because she had to go to work while our son is home suffering, right? She comes home and he's like moaning and groaning. And so she's, oh my gosh, I have to work while my son is suffering, right? That is new to the human experience, right? So yes, humans have been enduring labor and working for millennia, but if your loved ones needed you at the time they needed you, you could be there for them. For most people, except for the oppressed, obviously.
And he's not very, Marlowe's not going to be very efficient when he gets to the Congo because he needs rivets.
Yes,
right?
The rivets.
Rivets.
I need rivets.
Which is a mark of the industrialization, right? Mechanization. And he's not efficient. So now what is he? He's, inefficient and not helpful. And he has to wait, right, to get his work done because he needs rivets.
Very inefficient, right? And this is, I think, playing into the heart of darkness, right? This devotion to efficiency. When efficiency isn't happening, then you're at a loss. You're stuck, right? Stuck in the Thames, waiting for what is actually keeping them, which is the river, right?
Right.
And so, civilization is predicated on law, right? And so this is something in U.S. History 1 that we take a look at. John Adams was very much devoted to the law. Well, what is law predicated on? Law is predicated on natural law, right? If things go up, they come down, right? And so, but, and we try to use technology to bypass the law of nature, but there's always going to come a time where nature is going to break your ability to be efficient. So what I wanted to bring in here was an aspect of U.S. history.
Okay.
And so in U.S. History 2, we obviously study the conquest of the Western expansion, the conquering, that we call them territories. And that's a little bit misleading because that's a nice way of saying colonies, right? And so the West is being colonized. And eventually it is settled. And the Census Bureau in 1890 proclaimed that the West had been settled, right? So there was no more land to conquer anymore. And so there was this American historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, who was like one of the first PhDs coming from Germany, is going to make a lot of hay out of this. And so this famous essay that he delivers really becomes the basis of American Western history, right? Up until from the 1890s up until probably the mid 1960s. What he's going to argue here is really the basis of what students and academics alike would study and further expand in their scholarship when it came to studying the frontier in the West and all of that. So just bear with me. I'm going to read a few passages from the frontier thesis, and I think it'll be quite clear just to see the parallels with what he was talking about with the conquest of England from the Romans some 1900 years ago. So he opens up with, in this advance, the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. Much has been written about the frontier from the point of view of border warfare and the chase, but as a field for the serious study of the economist and the historian, it has been neglected. The American frontier is sharply distinguished from the European frontier, a fortified boundary line running through dense populations. So we have this difference. Europe is settled, it's hierarchical, right? This will be a little bit different in America. The most significant thing about the American frontier is that it lies at the hither edge of free land, right? Free land to them, but there's some people who live in that free land, right? Native Americans, right? The frontier is the line of the most rapid and effective Americanization, the wilderness, right? This is the jungle, if you will. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European in dress, industries, tools, mode of travel, and thought. And then it goes on, little by little, he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe, not simply the development of Germanic germs, yet more than the first phenomenon was a case of revision to the Germanic mark. The fact is that there is a new product that is American. At first, the frontier was the Atlantic coast. It was the frontier of Europe in a very real sense. Moving westward, the frontier became more and more American. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines. And to study this advance, the men who grew up under these conditions and the political, economic, and social results of it is to study the really American part of our history. The stubborn American environment is there with its imperious summons to accept its conditions. the inherited way of doing things are also there. And yet, in spite of environment and in spite of custom, each frontier did indeed furnish a new field opportunity, a gate of escape from the bondage of the past, the darkness of the past, if you will, and freshness and confidence and scorn of old society, impatience of restraints and its ideas, right? Breaking off from divine right of king, the hierarchies, the church, the state, right? And indifference to its lessons have accompanied the frontier. What the Mediterranean Sea was to the Greeks, breaking the bond of custom, offering new experience, calling out new institutions and activities, that and more. The ever retreating frontier has been to the United States directly and to the nations of Europe more remotely. And now, this is him lamenting the frontier is closed. And now, 4 centuries to the discovery of America at the end of 100 years of life under the Constitution. So he's writing again in 1890. The frontier has gone, and with its going has closed the first period of American history.
Yeah. And so he's obviously it's gloom and doom, but the Americans are going to say, wait, but no, we don't have to stop because we're in California. We could just take Hawaii, take the Philippines, keep going.
Cuba,
right?
Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So it's like, but to them, it's a safety valve, right? For Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier was a safety valve where we don't have class warfare because the sons can go. Unlike Europe, right, where they have what is it? The primogenitor, that it's like the first son and inherits everything, and we don't want to break up the great estates before, right? It was always go, right? And so they've been moving to the west. This also reminds me of,
which real quick though, isn't that interesting? Like the Americans are further developing this devotion to efficiency. That's
Right.
inefficient, right? And there's some truth to that. Usually the sons of great men turn out to be failed sons.
Yes.
So why have this idea of
Right.
passing on to the first son?
Right.
Let's open it up.
Yes. And so that was revolutionary also, right? That they didn't have the titles of nobility and primogenitor and all that stuff. But also it reminds me, so Frederick Jackson Turner wrote that in 1893, I believe is his but the classic American painting, American Progress from John Gass, right?
Yeah.
1872, where civilization is moving westward, right? And she's got the light and she's bringing, most of my students think it's an angel, but it's like Columbia and civilization moving from east to west. I think you mentioned that in your
She
last
has in her
talk.
hand a textbook and the telegraph over her shoulder.
Yeah, efficiency there too, right? Communications. Because even towards the west, they have like a Pony Express rider that he's like gonna be, taken over by the telegraph.
And behind her is light. You've got farmers kind of just gingerly walking around with their pickaxe and the gold, and then in the darkness is
the Native Americans
is looking over their shoulder and they're running into darkness. Right.
And so that was 1872. But so the idea of manifest destiny predates his, like, what are we going to do now? Gloom and doom.
Yeah, well, to him at that point in history, manifest destiny is coming to an end.
Right.
And what he's basically pointing out is, the white settlers going out there were able to get these landed opportunities. And that was the heart of democracy. The idea, was that once you have land, you have a stake in society, right? You will want it to progress.
Citizen farmers,
right? The yeoman farmer. That's over, is what Turner is saying. And so what is going to happen going forward?
So I've been trying to finish reading The Tragedy of American Diplomacy by William Appleman Williams.
Oh,
and
classic.
And he talks about, he picks up kind of around this time of imperialism. And so what he terms it is, and what's happening here in Africa too, throughout the Western world, is non-colonial imperial expansion, right? So it's not the time of setting up colonies and settlers, kind of like with America, Spain, and the
Dollar
Western, yeah.
diplomacy, Theodore Roosevelt
Yeah.
enacted.
So
Yeah.
now it's a non-colonial imperial expansion. Like, we're not going to send colonists, but we're going to send those merchants, the military, and the missionaries, right, to kind of set up our little shop, right, and to practice imperialism, basically.
Yeah, just basically pay off the powerful families in places like Nicaragua or El Salvador. Say, when our corporations come in, and they are, if they start saying things like they want more money and safer work conditions and the weekends off, use that money to thump them down, right? And if you need help, let us know, and then we'll send in our military. But very efficient, right? You don't have to spend huge resources to, like England, Great Britain taking over all of India, sending in their entire military, their bureaucrats. It was incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think they were moving towards more of like enlightenment. Like, this really looks bad, like maybe we shouldn't colonize anymore, but they're still fighting it because the money is good. The wealth, the wealth for their country.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know what else you wanted to talk about on that, but
yeah, we could talk about the yet, and I'm not sure, this is still in the first few pages yet, to understand the effect of what it had on me. You ought to know how I got out there and what I saw and how it came up the river to the place where I first met the poor chap. So this is Marlowe talking, and he's basically beginning his yarn of going into the Congo, but he's hearkening back to when he was a child. It was not the blank spaces anymore. And maybe I should go back in my notes here. Well, he was talking about as a child how he would look at world maps, and the places that hadn't been settled or conquered or colonized by European nations were all in white, right? And so he was kind of lamenting it was not a blank space anymore. It had got filled since my boyhood with rivers, with lakes and names. Well, Marlowe, those rivers and lakes and names of those rivers and lakes were already there by the people living in there, but I guess that's an aside right now. It had ceased to be a blank space of a delightful mystery, a white patch for a boy to dream gloriously over. So he's basically talking about places that have white patches. That's where he wants to go.
Right. Which is kind of what the United States did, trying to bring it back to like U.S. history. Is it the Guano Islands Act? Right. If you show up to an island and there's nobody there, then that means it's ours. God has given it to us. But and we can take, which I think they got Midway Island that way. And but it's like, I'm sure Marlowe's not the only one, and we have plenty of people here in the US at this time. It's like, where could I go to claim land for the US, right? So yeah, that's kind of there.
Yeah. And one of the themes that I'm picking up in this book is how the whole book is inconclusive, right? I mean, it doesn't end. We don't have to jump to the end of the book, but it's not a tidy end. It's, and it's really coming from this yarn that Marlowe is spinning. And so, just like well, it wasn't a conversation, but just like when somebody tells you a story, they're just kind of telling you a story to tell you a story, right? So, so Marlowe is telling the story, and it's not satisfying, right? It doesn't have this conclusion at the end, and it's very frustrating. So, is this because Conrad is not a good writer and he doesn't understand how to tie things at the end? Well, obviously not. I think it's quite purposeful. And what I think he's tying in here without explicitly saying is in this march towards progress, bringing forth enlightened ideals, untethered from the natural world, right? We have become just these heads without being embodied, without the bodies, right? This is goes back to Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. It's just this head navigating through the world, and the body
follows.
The body follows, but the effects of the world of the body, you can, we're in, it's not, it's actually very nice out. Can we take all this equipment, Simon, outside? It'd be really nice to be out there, right? But if it was hot out, we wouldn't be bothered by it, right? I've got water here. I didn't go to the river to get this water, right? We are disembodied from the world at large, right? It's so efficient, right? And what I think a lot of what's going on here is this kind of schism from old beliefs that tied people to the land, whatever people's agents of faith were, right? Whether it was Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, and even before that, animism, right? Which people who were animists never called themselves animists, right? It was just the way people were. You naturally were devoted to the source, and you sang praises to it. But now even these missionaries that we get to see in this book, they're mainly just cultural Christians. They're part of this game, this very dangerous, brutal game. And for them, they're there to spread the gospel and all of that, but it is in the service of conquest.
Right. Because when you said cultural Christians, if what one of the biggest commandments, like to love your neighbor as yourself, right? And if you really loved your neighbor, would you be treating them like that?
Yeah.
Would you be enslaving them if you really loved your neighbor, right? So
yeah, and this can bring us to in the controversy of immigration. It's so fascinating that the immigrant is so maligned today, right? And to bring in the gospel, the Good Samaritan. I mean, that is a story of an immigrant, right? It is the beat up Samaritan is referred to as a sojourner, right? And so, and in that story, Jesus is basically saying this person who's beat up, dejected, the Samaritan was the one that helped him. And even though, the backdrop of that story is the Jews and the Samaritans hate each other, and the Jew who's walking sees this beat up person is going, well, I'm on my way to the temple, right? And the Samaritan,
I can't be bothered.
This bad Samaritan is the one who helps this sojourner. And it's quite interesting. What we're reading in this is clearly the white characters, the European characters, clearly are living in alienation. They are separated.
So you talked about the other with Dr. Anderson?
Yeah.
And when I was hearing that, I was thinking about in the Declaration of Independence that there's no mention of slaves, African Americans, or African. It's just
that was taken out.
Yes, on purpose, right? Because they didn't want to. What is it?
Piss off the Southerners.
Yes, but it says also like no mention was made of the Negroes as to not contaminate our glorious fabric, right? Like how can we talk about freedom, equality, liberty, if we're going to write it. But what did they call them then? Because we had 3/5 of what is the word that they use in the Declaration?
Persons of servitude.
Other persons.
Other persons, okay.
3/5 of other persons.
Other persons.
And so that's the othering that you all were mentioning.
Okay.
In 1787, under our Constitution, they are 3/5 of other persons.
Not quite persons, other persons.
Yeah. So it's there.
Yeah. And in the remaining time, if there's anything else from part one that you would like to point out, I think most of these episodes that we do, we're going to look at part 2, part 3, but I think it is always good to bring up Achebe.
Okay.
I will assign a extra credit assignment on um, some commentary on Chiwana Achebe. He was a scholar and educator, and really the first person to really push back on this book. He's this book is probably in the huge pantheon of 20th century literature. This is definitely somewhere in the top 20, right? And this would be a staple for anybody prior to the 1970s to read, and to read at face value. And what Achebe is going to point out is there's a serious problem here, because the people living in the Congo are completely dehumanized. They're not even given humanity. They're given no names. The descriptions of them are animalistic. They're described as primitive, savage, cannibals, right? And so Achebe is going to rightly point out that this entire text is a racist text from the mind of a racist person. Now, that's the thing I want to be careful there is I remember being introduced to Achebe and wanting to be, a good liberal American and going, yeah, this book is garbage. I don't want to read anything more of it. But I do think, even though Conrad obviously is a man of his time, and I don't think it was an accident that he is not bringing the humanity of people. He doesn't seem to be a friend of this European Western enterprise of conquest. He's very critical of it. Right. And so when we get to part 2, part 3, and when we bring in one of the main characters of this book, Kurtz, we're going to see just how the heart of darkness is really affecting not the natives, not these people, living people who were doing just fine before Europeans came, but it is greatly affecting the people that get into this place, right? There's a passage in this book where Marlowe, what did he have, a tummy ache? Did he have to go see a doctor? He had some sort of ailment, but he goes to see the doctor, and the doctor starts measuring his head.
Oh, no, I think that's before he has to be, doesn't he have to be medically cleared to go?
Okay.
I think that's what it was.
All
And it's
right.
like, it'd be interesting to know, like, when does the mind start to go? Like,
Yeah.
and he's like, what is he talking about? And then he's over there, I was like, oh, I remember now I know what he's talking about.
Yeah, I think the doctor says something to the effect of, yeah, if you come back, I will remeasure your head and see if there's any changes.
Yeah, what is that called? That phrenology.
Phrenology was the faux science of the time, right?
Yeah.
This idea that you can measure the bumps on people's head to see if there was any kind of mental illness or the degree of intelligence
Don't
people
look
had.
too closely.
I've got a lot of hair in my head.
My brother would call me Flipper.
Yeah. So where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, that this is the heart of darkness. I think the deeper meaning that Conrad is bringing is the darkness was already there, right? This idea that you are not complete unless you accomplish. You are not complete unless you have wealth. Right. You are not complete unless you are efficient, be on time, make money, right? Be a consumer.
Right.
That is going to drive any human being insane, right? And yeah, going into the jungle, conquest, dehumanizing other people certainly isn't going to help.